Hello and welcome to Australia in Space TV. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the executive editor. Today we're going to be looking at a risky experiment funding Australia's space industry. We're going to be joined by Professor Phil Bland, who is the Director, Space Science and Technology Centre from Curtin University in my hometown of Perth. And it's great to be joined by Professor Phil Bland. Phil, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Chris. Thank you.
Now, you've written an article and you're calling, well, it's hard to say whether you're calling for more funding. I think you are in basic research. A lot of the funding is coming into applied research. We're going to have a broad audience, so I think we need to define applied versus basic research. But,
Yep.
I think it does come to the fundamentals of Australia in space as to what we're currently doing, right? So, you
Absolutely.
highlight that only about $2 million a year is being put into basic research in space for Australia versus all of the other sort of funding programs, Moon to Mars. You've got SmartSat CRC in Adelaide there, Modern Manufacturing Initiative and others, particularly in defence. We're seeing a lot of money going into defence.
Yes.
And you're a planetary scientist, so this is really the core of what you do.
I am.
Maybe let's define your basic research, what we're currently doing, and then maybe more of what we can be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So two flavors of research: basic and applied. Applied research is where you can see a definite target that you want to get to in terms of an innovation, and a clear path from where you are now to getting there. So getting like faster speeds for Wi-Fi or building an engine that's more fuel efficient, that type of thing. Often engineering is actually a branch of applied research. Basic research is where increasing knowledge is the key. Increasing knowledge is the goal, and it's actually the most effective mechanism humans have ever come up with in terms of generating new knowledge. You can get it with applied research, but that's not its goal. Its goal is to solve foreseeable problems. So that's why basic research is often a prequel to applied research. Basic research generates the knowledge. Applied research applies that knowledge to deliver innovations. In my area, in planetary science, there's a particularly close relationship between all of that, and in fact, between that and benefits for the wider economy and defence, and that's because answering questions, big questions, fundamental questions, as a researcher about, say, whether there's life on Mars. Requires us then to think about, okay, what kind of spacecraft could we build to do that? So instantly you get into really hard technical innovation, and your country really has just this great mechanism of throwing together its best scientists and its best engineers to answer problems that you're not thinking up. These are problems where the universe presents the obstacles to you.
Yep.
So in applied research, you really kind of want to find the path of least resistance to your more efficient internal combustion engine. Basic research, you haven't got any options. It's like, okay, I'm going to get to Mars and I'm going to land there softly, and it's the universe that presents the problems, which is much more challenging, very challenging, and that's how we get a lot of the amazing technical innovations that have benefited all of our lives over the last, especially the last 70 years, because really the pursuing basic research as a government-funded endeavor began just shortly after the Second World War.
Well, there's a business case to it, isn't it? The dollar return versus dollar invested is, multiple fold versus other types of research. And, you do highlight pretty much every other country that's operating in space is doing a lot more in basic research. Any benchmarks there? I mean, obviously the US and even the likes of, say, China and Russia will be way out in front. But one thing we've learned in space is, where is Australia's niche? Where is our strength going to be? Is basic research going to be one of those niche areas, given that everyone else is doing it as well?
Yeah, I mean, so it's an interesting one. Like as you say, you get these great multipliers for where overseas agencies that are operating on a science-based model and supporting fundamental research and those sort of missions that I've talked about. Mostly, they deliver at least a 3-to-1 multiplier. So you, based on $1 in from a taxpayer's money, you get 3 out, and that's in a single year. Over the lifetime of a project, might be up to 12-to-1. So that's an incredible return on investment. If we were all looking at that for our pensions, we'd be pretty happy. In terms of Australia's niche. We were actually doing really well in basic research in planetary science, remarkably, until until all of the recent funding. We were about 8th in the world. I think we're in fact above China.
Wow.
In terms of the research that we generated and the impact that had on the international community. So unfortunately, our research community has contracted substantially over the last couple of years, even while billions more has been spent in both civilian now and in military space funding.
You mentioned Curtin University is one of the largest teams left remaining. A couple of others went under during COVID. Do you anticipate that to come back? I mean, do you think the research will always be there? The universities will kind of bounce back, and is it a matter of the ideas and the research applications need to be there first to demand the funding? Because if they're contracted, then they can't get the funding because there's no one there applying for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately it's one of the harder areas, one of the harder sectors to rebuild when it's been damaged. So your kind of science sector is a hard one to rebuild, but it can be. The colleagues that I worked with when I first came to Australia 10 years ago, and we built a larger community together. Like I say, a lot of them have lost their jobs. Some of them have found part-time stuff at other universities. Some are now not in academia at all, which is a great shame. I mean, these were some of the top people, not just in Australia, but in the world.
Can I check are they still in the space industry, or are they leaving the industry?
No, so colleagues of mine now have left and are in. I think one of them is working for a geophysics company outside of Sydney. So there is, there are people there who can, if we got funding again, we could bring back, and certainly we can attract people from overseas. I think there's a lot of potential.
Yeah, right.
But it is quite a hard one to rebuild.
Now, maybe let's look at some of the strengths, because I think it's the outcomes from basic research, as you say. It's not only the new technologies and the new research methodologies that can come out, but the discoveries out of that, if you can prove your thesis or your idea. And it's also brought Curtin University to BINAR. You were in our inaugural launch edition of the Australian in Space magazine with BINAR 1. And that obviously allows you to motivate and your students and give them some new research opportunities as well. Maybe brief us on BINAR 1 and where you're currently at with that.
Yeah, so this is a really nice example, Chris, of how. So for me, I do this work because I love it and I want to find out stuff. One of the parts of that is seeing young people engage with it and just get super excited about doing science and engineering. I understand that my country doesn't necessarily want to fund this to make me happy.
That's fair enough.
But it's and that's fine. It's just my argument really is that it'll make a lot of people happy because we make an awful lot of money out of it. But yeah, on our project, so the lovely thing, this is a really nice example of how doing inspirational stuff really kind of captures the mind and the imagination of young people. So so our program BINAR we're flying small satellites now. It's taken 4 years for us to build our first one that flew last year. We've got another 6 in the pipeline. And that is heading towards our own moon mission. So we've got a plan to fly two small spacecraft around the moon in 3 or 4 years' time. That's just super exciting. So the fire that puts in. So we've got around at any one time about 60 Curtin undergrad engineers working on that. We've got a larger program, or a program called BinRX, which is to bring it to WA high school students. And the idea is that they'll be first ones, and then they'll spread the word, and then it'll kind of grow like that. But the first bunch all turned up like a couple of weeks ago, and we just had 60 super excited high school kids playing with bits of stuff that could actually go in a spacecraft. So it's fantastic, and that's because we're going to the moon, right?
Yep.
That's what that inspiration buys.
And one of the questions I have is, how much across the STEM areas are they? Are they just in particular areas, or do they cover all aspects?
All aspects. And we started, like, our first course that we did for undergrads actually had about 50-50 geologists and engineers. So it was planetary course, but there was some mission stuff in there as well. And that was really attractive to engineers. Another colleague of mine is running a course on spacecraft systems design, and that's super popular as well. That's just more than doubled this year in terms of intake. So it's basically, that's a benefit that I haven't exactly mentioned, is that help university researchers, and that's how you get trained engineers and scientists coming out the other end. I actually don't know what the plan is to do that if the university sector is contracting.
Well, and it brings us to the title there, a risky experiment for the industry. Because so basically you're proposing that we're thinking short term, we're thinking applied science where it's all about sovereign capability, but we're not thinking longer term, because you talk about high school students, right? So you're talking about another decade before they become somewhat seasoned and experienced in the sector and whatever they may go to. But if we're not funding the basic research, we're missing out on that opportunity, and no one else is doing it in this way. That's kind of where you're coming from.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, all of our kind of international partners in other spacefaring nations, other nations that aspire to be, all fund basic research at a decent basic research in space and planetary science at a decent level, and their funding has grown with their sectors because you need that new knowledge. If you aren't generating new knowledge, you're going to run out. It's like it is a finite resource. So, our approach in Australia, which formally excludes basic research from these funding
Well, I
schemes.
noticed that there was one here, and I can't put my finger on it right now, but it actually says unless it is applied, if it's basic research, this won't be covered, which is an amazing exclusion, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's common across all of the new funding schemes. So what it means is that that's actually a strategy. The strategy.
Who would make that? Who would make that call?
I think it's
not a planetary scientist for sure.
Not a planetary scientist, but I think it's kind of come down from our government really wants to see applied research and does seem to have problems with basic research. And unfortunately, I think that agency for a number of years, our new space agency for a number of years, really took that on board and possibly even doubled down on it. So it comes from that. And
that was, and I've found it now, the Moon to Mars Demonstrator Mission Scheme states STEM scientific or research projects without a clear commercialization pathway are ineligible activities. And that just flies in the face of everything we learn in this area, given, we want high risk, high reward.
Yes.
And
the program is called Moon to Mars, right? So how do you...
And to exclude, again, it's a bit of an eye-opener. One of the questions I had is, do you think a base level of research funding is required, a little bit like GDP, measured defence spending? There should be a 2 to 5% spending versus the overall spending. Is that kind of the model that we might look at?
I think Australia, I mean, Australia generally, in terms of basic research, could do so much more, and it's a real shame because the Australian, there are countries that don't do it efficiently, where they a lot of taxpayer dollars go in, and they don't rank very well in terms of internet. There are ways you can rank the effectiveness of your research sector like anything else, and there are countries that don't do very well there. Australia, actually, in terms of dollars in versus science out, is one of the best, and it wouldn't cost an awful lot more for us to, there was a while that we were actually competitive with China. It's kind of bonkers.
Right.
And so, yeah, like my favorite one actually is like have you heard of the diesel fuel rebate?
Right. Yes.
So diesel fuel rebate is basically helping, major mineral companies with their remote site, either power generation or access to remote sites, so that those large companies get a rebate on their use of diesel. It costs the Australian taxpayer about $7.8 billion a year. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and say possibly those companies would be okay if we weren't subsidizing their fuel. I'm not an expert on that.
You think maybe?
But I'm just going to throw that out there as a possibility, because I've not constrained that. I'm a scientist, right? So I've got to be. What I do know is that if we did that, if we used that for other things, we could increase our overall defense spending by about 10%. We could double our more than, no, it's more like triple our entire R&D budget, and we'd have still left over about a 1 to 2 billion for a real kick-ass space agency. So, or you can have the diesel fuel rebate.
Diesel fuel.
So the cash is there if we want to spend it, and we, in all of those areas, we have the capacity to be genuinely world leading, not just to develop domestic equivalents.
Well, I think you've raised that a very good sort of mirror up against what funding is being applied in certain areas. And when we talk about the Australian space sector over the next decade and what it's forecast to be, unless we're going to do it correctly and we're making the right decisions, and it is, well, it's not like it's a new industry. We've been, it's not new, but I think there are people coming into the industry that are relatively new, and they're making these calls without sort of fully understanding the implications of this into the longer term.
I think so. And it is, I'll just, one other point is that, I'm not saying that the current model means that that sector won't grow, right? The sector can't help but grow if we are spending billions of dollars on it. It's a question of, does it grow efficiently? Do we get those same returns on investment of times 3 per year, times 12 over project lifetime, as those other nations do? So that's the kind of, those are the multipliers that we have to see for the return, to get the return on investment with this unfortunately unique model that excludes basic research and generating new knowledge.
I think it's also the unknowns. These are the unknown unknowns because we don't know, unless we are funding basic research, we don't know what we're not discovering simply because it's opportunity lost. And you do raise the early sort of onset detection of tuberculosis, which came out of a hypothesis on the solar system and the like. So it's those linkages that we just don't yet know that can be quite groundbreaking. And I think that's the underlying importance of this particular area. What we'll do in the show notes, we will have a link through to thisistheconversation.com article that you wrote, Phil, and we'll also have a link out to your profile at Curtin University. Any other interesting things that you've got going on there at Curtin?
Oh yes. So right now, so we're putting together. You knew what the answer was.
Of course you do. Yes.
So right now we're preparing the application to the space agency for our moon mission, and then colleagues of mine have developed this incredible solution for analyzing like the entire imagery data set for a planet and working out how
Right.
many craters there are and what the age of the surface is. It's absolutely beautiful. No one else can do it. NASA can't do it.
Almost like a Google Earth on steroids.
Yeah, it's incredible, mate. It's so beautiful. And they're getting loads of papers out of that. There's other colleagues of mine who are doing amazing stuff looking at impacts, asteroid impacts. So every day I'm surrounded by just drop dead gorgeous things happening from a science point of view. It's a joy. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Professor Phil Bland, Director Space Science and Technology Centre at Curtin University there in Perth. Absolute pleasure, and we look forward to having you on again. I think for you called it what was it, binar, and that's a
Yeah.
Noongar word too as well. I like
It is, exactly. So
and
the Southwest Council allowed us to use that to name our program. It's really good.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, look, we'll keep track of this, and we'll try and keep Curtin. We've got a good partnership with Curtin there as well. There in Perth. So keep an eye out for the next edition of the Australia in Space magazine, and we'll have an update in that. So Professor Phil Bland, thank you very much for joining us on Australia in Space TV.
Thanks, Chris.
Great. Thank you.